My recent research looks at executive compensation practices for public firms, and it identifies a series of potentially problematic practices that CEOs and senior executives use to increase their own pay, perhaps without shareholder knowledge. This research follows up on a very public scandal that was known as backdating, a practice that was identified about 10 years ago that was pretty widespread actually in public firms and in Silicon Valley. The basic practice was this, that is, companies would give stock options to executives and employees today, but act as if they had given them 2 months earlier. The reason for this is that allowed the companies to claim that they had given stock options to individual employees at a time when the stock was much lower. That is, so an option gives an employee the right to buy stock in the future at the current stock price. So imagine you joined Intel today and the stock is $100. If I give you the option today, in the future at some point, you might be able to buy stock for $100. But what the companies were doing was they would sit down with you today and they would look back and say, well, it's $100 today, but 2 months ago, the stock was only $80. So let's pretend that we had given you the option 2 months ago, and that means in the future you can buy the stock for $80 instead of $100. You're $20 richer. When this was revealed, it was a huge scandal, obviously, because it involved partly lying on the books, misstating accounting earnings effectively, and maybe even being deceptive or misleading the public about when the option was granted. So CEOs and CFOs around the country were fired. Investigations were launched. There was public outcry, and Congress was upset. There were criminal investigations. It was one of the biggest scandals that we've seen in corporations for decades. After that outcry, there was some legislation and some practices that were intended to bring backdating to a halt. And everybody declared victory. They said, we stopped backdating, and the way we've done this is we've encouraged companies to award options on the same day every year. So you can't play dating games. Our research picks up at this point and said, well, hold on, not so fast. The practice of giving options the same day every year solved some problems, the backdating and the dating games, but it probably created others. And so our research looks at the host of problems that were created by this new attempt to solve an old problem. And we find that, in fact, a lot of new problems were created that in some ways were maybe worse than the original problem. So the cure is maybe not as bad as the disease, maybe it's a little worse, maybe it's not quite as bad, but at least the cure has problems. One of the unintended consequences of the forced or scheduled options is that it twisted or perverted CEOs' incentives in the period leading up to the option. So let's imagine I gave you every year the right to buy a million options of your company on February 1st. And you're the CEO all year long, but on February 1st, I give you the right to buy 1 million options at the current stock price. Well, what are your incentives going to be in January, right? Do you want the stock price to shoot up in January, so you have to pay a lot more in the future to buy more stock? Or all things equal, would you rather the stock price to drift down a little bit in January? Well, the incentives are pretty clear. You'd rather the stock price be low in January and then higher in February and March. Well, we took a look at options and stock price, and we found, surprise, surprise, that that's actually what happened. That the stock price of companies run by executives who were given these sorts of options, oddly enough, dropped in January. And then after February 1st, when the options were granted, at that point, the stock price turned around and went up. And the magnitude of these swings, that is the decline before and the increase afterwards, was pretty significant. So what we find is that if you pay CEOs and executives in a way that gives them the incentive to have low stock prices, they have low stock prices a few months a year, and it's very predictable, and there's just no way this happens by chance. So they release announcements. And it turns out if you look at the stock price reactions to the announcements in January are all negative, or on average negative, and the announcements in February and March are positive, and it suggests that investors are surprised in a good way. The reason this research matters, I think, is that it's an example of the kind of misbehavior that people are concerned about in public companies. CEOs and executives have a lot of discretion, stewardship over vast amounts of money, and this is an example of them using their position for their own benefit and shareholders' harm. So that's one reason. The other reason is it suggests stock prices are maybe inaccurate in a predictable way over a relatively large period of time. And as a society, we want stock prices to be accurate. And the third reason I think this is important is that it shows how difficult it is to regulate human misbehavior. A bunch of creative, powerful people are going to find ways to bend each system, each set of rules to their own advantage. And so while backdating was a big problem, setting up scheduled options seemed like a reasonable solution to stop backdating. Well, it was, but it created this host of unintended consequences that I think highlight how tricky it is to regulate the behavior of managers of public companies. One potential solution to this problem would be to grant CEOs or senior executives options throughout the year. So you give them a little bit over maybe each month over the year. That removes their incentive to have sharp swings, say in January or March, if they get a little bit throughout the year. You could also randomly award CEOs or executives stock options, and then they wouldn't know when to manipulate the earnings or the stock prices in the way we identify. That would remove the incentive of the CEOs or the executives to fiddle with the stock price at any one particular time, but there's no reason companies couldn't just do it on their own.